So let's go ahead and take a look at our data here, our JSON payload, because this is what we're going to be parsing the information from. So you can see here, once we constructed our URL, so we have this forecast daily. In this case, it's Spokane. You can put any city you want. Of course, you should have your own app ID here. And units, in this case, is imperial. You could put metric if you want, but imperial, because I live in the United States, so that's what we use here. Okay, so you put whatever you want there. But the most important thing is the data is going to be the same per se, meaning the structure of it is going to be the same. So we need to understand how do we map this payload here into the data that we need to parse through and then make sense of it, meaning the application has to make sense of it so that we can show to the user. Now you can see here, this whole payload here has a lot of information, but most importantly, you see at the top, we have the city as an object itself, right? Because you can close it and it has all these fields inside of, we have another object coordinates and so forth. So this in itself, it's its own entity, if you will. Then we have the cod for code of some sort, message for something, and count. This count here is how many items inside of our list do we have, meaning how many days do we have for our forecast. So we have 7. Now, the interesting part here is that we need to construct our data models so that it knows exactly how to read all of these. Because remember here, the most important piece of data actually, or pieces of data, should be inside of our list here. So if I close down here, notice this is a list. It's an array or list containing objects. Now, each of these objects here, if you click, this is 1 day worth of forecast. This is 2nd day, 3rd, and so forth. So the idea here is that we are going to loop through our list. Of course, we're going to get the city name and all that stuff, all this information here. That is easy to do because we are directly connected to this object there, right? But the important part here is that we need to map through all of the items inside of our list. So all of these forecast dates that contain information. So in this case here, if we want the first day, right? We have the date. This is actually the first day in a computer timestamp, of course. There's sunrise, sunset, and we have this other object here of temp, which will give us the day, minimum, max, night, evening, morning, and so forth. Pressure, humidity. And then we have the weather, which is another array containing one object, which has the ID, the main, description, and the icon. So there's a lot of things here we need to understand in order for all of this to make sense. So let's go ahead and map all of our payload here into structs that will then be decoded so that we can actually have objects we can loop through and get this information. So inside of our data here, let's right click. I'm going to add a new file. It's going to be a Swift file. That's fine. Let's call this main forecast, something like this. Okay. Let's go ahead and also import SwiftUI, just in case we need that. So what we're going to do here again is we are going to map all of these items, all of these objects here into structs that would be decoded into Swift objects so we can actually retrieve that data. So the first thing I'm going to do here, I'm going to create a struct. This struct here, I'm going to name forecast weather response. And I'm going to make this decodable because we're going to use a JSON decoder to decode this, right? And then this needs to confirm to the decodable protocol because we are going to be able to use the JSON decoder to decode this into something we can use. Now, the fields here are very important. What fields am I going to use? Well, first of all, if I look at the whole payload here, we have this city as a field, we have the list. So if you look at the main payload here, we have city and we have list as our main objects, really. Okay. So the first field here, I'm going to say var city is going to be of type city. Now, why is it type city? Well, because city, as you see here, it has its own properties or fields. Okay. So we need to make sure that we actually get all of these fields so we can map it all together. So I'm going to have a city, which we haven't created this class or structure yet. So I'm going to make that optional. I'm going to say var cod or for code, which is this here. So it's kind of outside now. That's totally fine. It's going to be a string type var message double var cnt. That's count. It's going to be an int type and var list. This is the fun part. Now the list in this case here, we're counting from the top, right? The list in this case here is an array, right? this array will have some sort of type. The types that we need are these types here. So we can call whatever we want, but notice that this is an object. So we need to pass the types that are expected in this list. So in this case here, I'm going to just put an array, and it's going to be expecting what I'm going to call the main forecast params. Now, these are names that I am using myself to organize myself. Notice we haven't created them. That's why we're having issues here, right? So this forecast weather response will include all of this payload, right? So now we are saying the city variable or the city field contains a city type, which we haven't created because city type would be this. That's an object, right? And then because it's outer one, we say city, we have cod for code. There it is, message, count, and list. Now for list, we're expecting an array, which means we have to pass main forecast params in array. We haven't created that. Let's create it right now. So I'm going to copy this, and outside here, I'm going to say struct, and this is also going to be decodable. So pretty much everything will end up being decodable here because for reasons I just said. So now for each of our items here, let's go back to our list. We have what? This is the object we are looking into now. So this main forecast param here, we are going to go and fetch each one of these items or fields. Notice that we also have an object inside there as well. Okay? And another array there which contain object. So we have to put all of them as one object, which is represented by main forecast params. All right, so I'm going to say var dt, that's an int, var temp, that's a temp type. Why? Because this temp here, remember, it's not just a field, but it's also expecting an object which contains other fields. That's why we are separating it as well. I'm going to say var pressure. Make sure the names are exactly the same. This is going to be double. Var humidity. It's an int. Var weather. Notice the weather in this case here, it's expecting an array containing types of weather, correct? There's this weather there, an array containing this object which we'll create. And then we continue down, we're going to get pressure, humidity, speed, degree, and so forth. So I'm going to say var speed, double, var degrees, int, var clouds. It's also an integer. Very good. So making the progress, make sure we are getting exactly what we want. Okay, the names have to be exactly the same because we're mapping things through here. All right, next, let's go ahead and create a temp struct here. So this is also going to be decodable, right? And our temp, of course, notice temp has day, min, max, night, eve, and morning. Very simple. Var day, that's a double. Var min, that's also a double. Var max, that's a double. There we go. So we finished all of our temp. Very good. And while we're here, let's go ahead and another struct here. It's going to be the city. Create for a city there. Decodable. And for our city, do you remember? Let's go back to our city. We have these fields ID, name. We have chord, which is also another object containing long and latitude. Okay, you see? Var ID is going to be int. String for name. Chord is going to be of type chord, which we haven't created. Country. It's going to be a string. And then we have var population. It's going to be an integer. Time zone. It's also going to be an int as such. So exactly the same what we have there. Okay, let's go ahead and create struct chord for coordinates. Decodable. And for our coordinates, we have long and lat. That's all we have. So I'm going to say var lon double. Our lat is also going to be double as such. That's all. And let's go ahead and do the weather because that's one of the last ones that we have here. Struct decodable. And we'll say var ID, it's going to be int. Remember, let's go to weather again. It's inside ID, main description icon. Var main, it's going to be a string type. Var description, It's going to be a string as well. Var icon is going to also be a string. Okay, make sure all of these are exactly the same. Let's not forget to put an optional there as well. Okay. So now we've mapped everything from our payload here, right? Even things inside of our list. So this is how you should always think about, right? So we have forecast weather, which will include everything. We know this because it has city. And also has a list that contain main forecast parameters, which are each one of our items inside of our list. So each one of these forecast objects. And inside of this forecast object, we have the date, we have the temp, which is an object itself. We create it down here and so forth. You see, everything is enclosed inside of another object for simplification. This means whenever we, for instance, get our forecast weather, we can say forecast weather response dot city, for instance. We could go to city and we can get the ID, we can get the name, we can get chord, which is actually object. I can say chord dot and get lawn and so forth. So we can actually start going inside of each object to retrieve the data that we want. All of that is possible because we enclosed everything, the whole payload, first of all, inside of this forecast weather response. Now remember, these names are our own. We could have named it whatever we want. However, the actual fields inside are not our own. We had to actually copy or have exactly the names of fields that we have from our payload. That's the most important thing. Otherwise, we're gonna run into issues. All right, so that was a lot of typing here. Of course, you don't have to type all of this thing. What you can do, you can always download this project and then copy the main forecast and just paste it all in. That way you don't end up with a lot of errors. But in any case, I just wanted to show you how to do this.